Welcome to TechnAct, a podcast where we have conversations with different people doing research or activism in relation to social movements, gender, sexualities, and digital technologies. My name is Nadia.
And my name is Onur. Hello everyone. Today we are joined by Adi Kuntsman, who is a senior lecturer in digital politics and coordinator of a master's program in international relations and global communication at Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK. Adi has been publishing on the issues of gender, sexuality, migration, violence and collective memory, which makes it a very interesting for our group, and we are looking forward for this discussion today.
Welcome, Adi, and thank you for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your research interests, all these things?
Okay, well, I'll try to keep it short. I've been researching, all the issues that you have outlined, but also all of this through the prism of the internet and digital cultures for about almost 15 years now. And looking back, I think I've been following the internet as it has developed. So it went from online forums, chat rooms, websites, and kind of non-interactive materials, kind of citizen web production, to blogs that were linked into a social network, to social networking sites. And as I was evolving with my own work, all this kind of what we have today is kind of social media environment has grown really, really rapidly. So I feel like I've been researching it from fairly early days. So while I don't have much technological knowledge, but I feel like ethnographically I followed that, and I've covered a scarily broad number of issues. I've started researching in minority queer and minority ethnic community and kind of how it builds itself online, to issues of online violence, Islamophobia, homophobia, racism, to digital militarization of social media platforms by armies and states, and not just civilians, to then issues such as various forms of social media protests, such as Selfie protests, to more recently, kind of my most recent work is about, rather than looking at the digital, is about asking questions whether we can remove ourselves from the digital. So whether it's a citizen's right to refuse, to not participate, to not be part of a database, to opt out. And paired with that is also my very, very recent work is on the environmental kind of material implications of the digital, but motivated by this question of, do we actually need that much of digital stuff, both in terms of civilian citizen rights, but also in terms of the material environmental impact, which is tremendous and which is not being talked about, of digital communication. So that's...
Thank you. Thank you very much. So in our previous episode, we were discussing some things in relation to algorithms and the people behind them. Adi, to put you in context here, last time we talked about how algorithms per se are not the responsible of all the bad things, quote unquote, but rather the people that create these algorithms that come with their own biases. So what do you think of this?
Wow, that's a huge topic, and actually probably the least close to my expertise, because I need to be very honest, I don't have much technical expertise, so my expertise is social. I wouldn't say that there is that algorithms are kind of those living beings that have bad intentions. It is totally about those who design them. The issue, however, is that we tend to see technology and algorithm as the latest kind of incarnation, as neutral. It's been designed to do stuff. So once it's been designed to do stuff, we kind of delegate responsibility to it. So we don't animate it as we don't think it's a living being, but we think, like we say, the computer did something, so the algorithm did something. And it makes it really difficult for us to look at the biases which are not accidental. So I think it's easier to accept an accidental error, an aberration, rather than something that is built into the system of how algorithms are designed. So there's a beautiful book, which I'm sure you know about, Algorithms of Oppression by Selfie Noble, who talks about how racist and gender discrimination and violence is built into what algorithms do. So I won't lecture on that because that's kind of, that's a book, an absolute must to read. But I will talk about something that actually I was just reading today, very recently, a case of London-based researcher, Eyal Weizman, who is the forensic architect and the lead of a kind of independent academic lab that uses architectural knowledge and forensic architecture to fight injustice. So like they look at how armies control population vertically, right, through built-in architecture. So anyway, so he was on his way to the US, where he has visited many times, to an opening of an exhibition, and he got a message the day before boarding the plane that he was his visa was rejected and he was not allowed to go. And he then went to the embassy and he was told that the algorithm flagged him either based on the places that he had visited, or his contacts, or a combination of the above, and we do not know what that is. And then they offered him, and I'll explain why I'm bringing this as an example. Then they offered him to provide the visa people, provide them with details of all the people he talked to, his contacts, which he refused to do, and therefore didn't go. And he issued a statement explaining all that. So that kind of gives us, this is a really good example. It's obviously one of many, because algorithms are used by police, they're used by government, but it's one example of many where we've got algorithms are being used by state and police power for civilians, and it's kind of at the same time, so they're adopted into using these forms of governmentality, but they're black boxed at the same time. So that's one of the things that Safia Noble's write about, is how to unblack box an algorithm. So we don't know what it is, but the algorithm flagged you. And I think this is, so to me, the question, rather than saying, is it the bad computer people who did it? Is it the bad algorithm? I think we need to look at what our increasing reliance on algorithm actually does, and we need to start looking in various spheres what it would actually do and who it affects and how it affects us unevenly. So yes, we are all being surveyed and determined by digital technologies, and then kind of our behavior is predicted by algorithms, but we're also incredibly uneven in the face of it. So it could be predicting your consumer behavior, which annoying but whatever, versus being racially profiled, versus being ethnically profiled. And as a result, it could be from as benign as kind of targeted advertising to as extreme as denial at borders, denial of movement, or even targeting you with a drone, right? So for now, drone strikes are targeted with facial recognition of a specific person, but why not? And I fear that this is actually the future. Why not, the same algorithmic selection that picks up people with this under suspicion of terrorism, which is very clear religious and racial profiling rather than anything else. So next stage will be shooting. So again, to me, is the question of, don't blame computers themselves, but it is how they're designed and how they're implemented, and how, while doing that, we black box that process and say, well, but the computer said, but the algorithm flagged, and that kind of removes all responsibility. And as I was thinking about this example, I even made a note. It occurred to me that it takes us back to the history of bureaucracy in service of totalitarian regimes, right? So it was just, so I'm thinking from Nazi Germany to the Soviet Union to a range of totalitarian and genocidal regimes but it's been flagged. So it is a kind of blind following the rules or following the definition. So to me, this is something very similar, very new in terms of technology, but very similar in that sense.
Yes.
Kind of like saying, like, for example, in relation to the past, for example, like the things that you were saying, like in Nazism and all these things, it's the system that flagged you. It's the system, like a black box,
exactly.
right?
Yes, exactly.
In the same sense, then we're black boxing algorithms, and like leaving it, like the people that made these algorithms came with all their prejudices and all these things and built this, and then they are just saying, but like algorithms did it. This is whatever.
Blame the system, and it gives so much arbitrary power to the surveillance systems that we are not aware of. And this is maybe like connected to neoliberal condition we are in now, where our consumer identity is actually so much also reshaping our political identity.
Absolutely.
So yes, do you have any more thoughts on that?
Well, I've got tons of thoughts, we only have so much time. But I mean, one thing that we could think of is whether it's just the neoliberal condition or whether actually the neoliberalism is masking something else, which is genocidal racial regimes. Because consumer culture is so prevalent, it's again black boxes and masks other things. And because those of us who are kind of free or more privileged with the use of these technologies, so we see them mostly on the consumer side. And I think what we don't realize, there's kind of interesting relation between, first of all, military technologies being adopted into civilian use, and then back. So then civilian use is being militarized. So it's a kind of a circular movement. So if we have drones, right, which were developed as a weapon, but they also deliver Amazon packages. Yeah. So we've got, there was a French philosopher, Paul Verlaine, who called it civilizing military technology. So, and the internet basically is one beautiful example, was developed as a military network, and then it's being civilianized, and we forget the history. Yeah. But then there is also things that are mundane and everyday, like social media, which was developed for people to talk to family members and, I don't know, self-promotion on Instagram via, the crazy amount of pictures of our food. And kind of, it's about the everyday moment, the banal, the normal, the boring, the routine, which then is militarized into something. So that's the work that I've done on in the book Digital Militarism that I wrote with Rebecca Stein, where we looked at how Facebook in particular, and it was over a decade ago. So these things have changed. In the meantime, we've got our fake news, we've got our Cambridge Analytica, our social media propaganda. That was before it, where Facebook, which was the place for people to share the banal, was then adopted by state players using the same vernacular language of the banal. So the state pretends to be a person, and then a military machine and a settler colonial militarized to the teeth occupation becomes this fluffy person. So when they speak the language of kind of this personalized everyday, I think so much has changed since. So now we've got tweeting politicians and fake news and, you name it, elections and referendum, which are affected by, again, algorithmic kind of swaying of opinion. But it was also a really interesting example, a scary example of how things develop for the everyday, and of course with a commercial interest in mind. So it's not that social media platforms care about our food or our pets, they care about income generation based on advertising, but then again it kind of masks various powers.
Yeah, definitely. So in that sense, can we talk about algorithmic politics?
I think we should. I think today we cannot not talk about algorithmic politics. Yeah. And it doesn't mean to say that all politics are fake news or everything. We're not blind. We're not fully... one thing we need to remember, we're not fully passive in the face of technology. We're also agents. We're active. We adapt. And an example of a state adapting it is one. An example of citizens resisting is another. So we don't just take it as it is. We could, but mostly don't. But it is about how algorithmic governance is affecting everything. And it could be to our benefit, it could be to our disadvantage. So it could be... I still remember the early days of when... I think it may be still prevalent today, where people are trying to work the algorithm. So say 10 years ago, how do you make a hashtag trend? You just call everyone and, make everyone post and use the hashtag, and then it's going to trend. Yeah. And now we laugh at it as something almost naive, because we now know that you can pay for something to, to float up, or it can even be done with an order from above, with a corporate or state, right? But kind of those early days where the visibility of stuff online is determined by kind of social media popularity. So you flood it to kind of bring it up. That is now gone, but something else is in place. So I think, we also have the endless capacity to resist one way or another. But I do agree. I think we need to think about politics that are informed by algorithms.
Yeah.
One way or another.
Definitely. I think in that sense, especially states are very slow in relation to technology. Like technology always goes faster than governments can respond to these kinds of new paradigms, right? So, for example, this happened with a few years back in the video game industry. Something called the Gamergate happened, and this was basically a harassment campaign against some particular especially women, developers of video games.
Oh.
And some of these persons, but particularly one, she got harassed so much, and she, like, there was no legislation for all the threats, all the things that she had, mastered that. And in that sense, she went to, the government, says like, listen, I have proof that I am being bullied and being harassed. My life, my physical life is in danger because I have been doxxed. My personal address has been published, and I've been having like, people on the streets, like all these things, terrible. And the response of the government was like, but we don't have legislation for that. Like, what are these tweets? What is this? What is Twitter? And this was a few years back. But now we can see still things like that. I mean, it took a while, but now I think in the US they have, one legislation that says something about Twitter and something about social media. But this is not the case for all the governments. So we see now, if you get cyberbullied, and this is something, for example, in Colombia, recently, a male that was who was doing bad stuff, he got cyberbullied and committed suicide. This is horrible, but there's no legislation to say, we can stop this. This is not okay.
It feels like when it comes to surveillance, the states are very quick in adapting, but when it comes to protecting human rights, they are very slow.
Or human rights.
It?
I was just going to say that. I mean, I thought, like, as you were talking, I was thinking exactly about what you said, and I made a note of, it's not that that legislation is generally slow. It's just slow to protect the vulnerable, because exactly like you say, so when we, if you think about the use of digital technologies for policing, they're not slow at all. So if you, or when state, and I think Russia was among the first, now kind of the rest follow, definitely Britain, definitely the US, arresting people based on what they post on social media, right? So there is no massive lag. There is no, and it's I think then, so when you put the two together, the difference is striking. So you've got a person who has basically a full dossier or full proof, and all you actually need is, I agree that legislation itself, kind of law, develops slower. So all you need is to translate, and it's it's a question for lawyers, right? Which is actually very similar to some religious legislators, where you say we've got rules from the old days. Now we need to define newer phenomena and basically include this into the definition of threat, bullying, whatever it is, right? And it's actually very easy to do, but they're very fast when you can include this stuff as a definition of anti-state, incitement to violence, terrorism. So I think we need to look at this disparity of speeds where things move way too fast.
Yeah.
So now, and kind of those who are more vulnerable have long known it. I think the rest of us are catching up. So people from racialized, minoritized, migrant groups and activists have known for a very long time that say whatever they write on social media is under surveillance. I mean, you ask most Muslim people in the UK, they say, we know, we self-censor in terms of what we write, because under PREVENT, which is the UK anti-terror legislation, basically, any innocent thing paired with your demographic targeting could lead to, from arrest to you name it. So it's that disparity. And that disparity when things move really fast and when the legislation refuses to catch up. And I think corporate interests there are also at play. So another example would be, which is less political, but the example of the digital estate, the digital ownership, or digital assets they're called. So all the things that we have online, whether it's access to our accounts, whether it's our social media, basically everything. Say, what will happen to all our digital stuff when we die? Like, who will have access to it? Who can modify it? Will this content live forever? Can our loved ones see it? So there is now newer development within law to expand kind of stuff around assets, ownership, wills into digital domains. Because it's driven by monetary interests, this will move faster than protecting people who are cyberbullied.
You're right.
Yes. And I actually, from here, I would like to move to discussion to the rise of the subject, the political subject. and when it comes to participatory politics, because you have a strong emphasis on digital politics in your research, and I want to ask, how do you think digital technologies affect today's participatory politics? Is it just being reduced to slacktivism, like passive activism, or is it something more than that?
Wow, that's a huge question for another couple of hours. I'll just put kind of a couple of random thoughts. I think on one hand, no, we shouldn't dismiss what we've seen in the last decade, starting from the Arab Spring and then mass of online protests where the internet and social media have been incredibly empowering. So we can't just throw the baby with the water and say, this doesn't matter. It's, it's just slacktivism, or it's just clicktivism or Twitter activism, because people have been doing social media stuff and they've also been going out to the streets as a result of social media. And I think also the vast difference, I think to me one of the interesting things is that things tend to look very similar, but they're actually very different internationally. So we see a bunch of people doing a hashtag action and then they go on the streets. So it looks very similar. You look at Hong Kong, you look at Russia, you look at the US, look at the Middle East, they all look the same, but they're actually not. So the cultural systems are different, the system of governance are different, who is participating, whether it has opened doors to a different demographic of participation. For example, whether, say more women, or different in terms of age, different in terms of ability, which not that many people talk about, or is it reproducing the existing patterns, right? So if we do have activism, but it's mostly, say, young, single, mostly men, almost all from dominant ethnic groups, almost always able-bodied, is that the same thing happening online? So I would kind of look at that rather than saying there's been a growth of participation or that there's been slacktivism. Another thing that we need to look at is that these things are constantly changing, but also people's ability to resist is changing. So whether it's constantly doing things differently. So it used to be more and more visibility. I think people today are a lot more cautious and a lot more activists are using alternative forms of communication. So it used to be that you would post on Facebook and you'll confirm, you do a Facebook event and you confirm your participation. Basically, you've just given the police a list of people going there. Thank you very much, without. So I think now there's a lot more awareness, and there are different alternative ways of doing it, which again depend on the context, depend on local forms of governance. So I think the impact has been huge. Another thing that I worked on that you probably want to know about is the use of selfies, and more broadly the use of the visual, which is another huge topic, but I'll kind of put it here on the table with relation to participatory cultures. Because social media has moved to become incredibly and increasingly visual, our participation is also very visual. So it kind of has all the history of, when you were dependent on journalists, so you had to be seen, you had to be photographed. Now it's kind of all Web3 or Web4, we photograph ourselves. So we've got parallel development of the kind of me-centered, self-promotion, narcissistic, if you like, culture of Instagram and endless selfies. And then you've got the exactly same modes of visibility being used for activism. So selfie activism or selfie citizenship is one of those where you basically you can't see it on the podcast, but it's a person with a piece of paper, hashtag and a message, and you take a selfie of yourself with a message. And you could say, it's just a selfie, we all take selfies. And in some contexts it is. So some celebrities absolutely are joining this because it's just another way of promoting yourself. So if it means let's put a hashtag on whatever down with something, or bring someone back or get someone away, sure thing, we'll do it. But we also, and we heard it today in today's keynote, we shouldn't underestimate depending on the context, the enormous courage it takes to make yourself visible and say, this is me, as me, and we are identifiable. Now, this is me, and I express my opinion. And rather than being invisibilized, either as a particular group, ethnic or racial or religious, or as someone who is expected to be supportive of their government and saying, no, actually we're not. So we're here, but it's really, really tricky because with the rise of selfie activism, another thing that developed at the same time is biometrics and facial recognition. So when the rise of, selfies as a kind of trendy phenomenon is coming to being a decade old, 8 years old. Entered the Oxford Dictionary in 2013, so 7-8 years old as the thing. Now everybody knows what's a selfie. Everybody takes a selfie. Selfies are used to be identified. So we kind of have this, and there was a massive excitement about the use of selfies in the range of arenas. But what was creeping up in the meantime is facial recognition, which I think, again, today, the last maybe year or two, is on everyone's mind. So we're more aware. When I was working on selfie activism, most people weren't aware. And not just academics who did this work, but generally, I think there was less awareness. That basically, every time you post you post your selfie, you also you contribute to the growth of a facial recognition database. And Facebook has gone one of the largest. And it's a system, again, we don't want to anthropomorphize it, but it is a system that's learning. So the more images of yourself are there, the easier it is to recognize. And lo and behold, this year we've got governments in several countries around the globe which are using blanket facial recognition on crowds to do stuff, whether it's demonstrations. Met Police in the UK is doing it. So here we go. So it's kind of, and I kind of now, when I think back to your question of participatory culture, we need to look at what would be the next step for digitally informed or in dialogue with the digital participatory culture, citizen protest. How will look next? We don't know. One of them is the rise of using makeup and hairdo that protects your face from facial recognition cameras. It is prominent among some activists in some countries where your face is unrecognizable, unreadable as a face. Just kind of geometric, black and white and with hair. Maybe that. Or maybe, parallel to slacktivism will become a new form of fashion. We don't know. Maybe the next activism will be, I kind of see, if I have to characterize the type of citizen participation and activism today in relation to the digital, I would say there are two ways or two main categories. One is to engage more with digital tools, better, faster. So like you said earlier, to preempt the next move and do it faster. It could be hacking, hacktivism. Hacktivism is a form of electronic civil disobedience. So that's one direction. Or confusing the algorithm by doing seemingly erratic behavior. Another one, which I keep thinking about, is actually withdrawing from the digital. And it's anything from VPN to protect or kind of any other forms of technologically informed self-protection from surveillance. So your location isn't detected. I mean, it's also basic digital literacy, in terms of your geolocation or what you share, but it's also more advanced ways of removing yourself from being part of the database, to maybe just moving to completely non-digital forms of participation. If we look into science fiction, we'll see that they're already, you have and this is, so it's not new, right? We know that any digital trace is a trace and you'll be found. So what would be an alternative?
Yeah, definitely. And also, I believe that, like, when we talk about surveillance and, and all these things, I would say that, like you said, some years back, people were not so aware of these things. But now, even your phone is asking you to unlock your phone with your face, with your fingerprints. And this is something, but many engineers, as me, or most, I would say, we avoid putting anything in this because we actually know how it works. We're like, listen, but I have had this conversation with some friends that are not engineers, and they're like, oh, but it's so easy to do it. I'm like, yeah, but you're giving your ID, you're giving your everything, your fingerprint all the time. And they're like, oh, but they're going to find it anyway. It's like, yes, but my thing is, if they want to find me, for example, if the government want to find me, I would, for me, it's like, listen, you have to do more, like 2 more clicks to find me rather than I'm giving you everything. So that is another thing.
Absolutely.
Also, like people being aware but not aware. like, oh yeah, I'm aware that this is a thing, but then but it's so easy,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So I don't. Yeah, maybe it's not a question, but like it's just a comment on what you were saying.
And also this is showing this maybe the blurring lines between our digital and physical forms of, let's say, citizenship. Then it is. I want to actually ask in this case, do you think it would be because this ongoing surveillance in digital platforms is affecting our very bodies in many ways, especially when it comes to more authoritarian contexts and people who are living under oppressive governments? And do you think this creates kind of a new form of digital divide? Because when you put yourself on social media for political reasons, in certain contexts you are even in more danger now.
Absolutely. I mean, it's kind of, I think we need to think more carefully and more thoroughly about the difference between more totalitarian and less totalitarian regimes, simply because some of the so-called less totalitarian or so-called democratic, I mean, like the US or the UK, they're actually not. So there are on so many ways. So or maybe they're partial democracies for some. And also they're very highly consumer society. So it could be that a kind of lacks of freedom or incredibly strong forms of governance that don't affect everyone, right? So they affect only some racialized communities, only immigrants, only non-citizens. But as long as you're white and citizen and middle class, you're safe. So, but let us not confuse this with everyone. But because these are often also the people who do the laws and who do the engineering and who do the research and development and who own the digital industry, there is this beautiful illusion that this is a more democratic form of digital existence, beautifully disguised by consumer culture and convenience. I mean, one of the things that I always talk with my students about is this kind of tension between convenience and scary creepiness of the digital. But because it's so convenient, so yes, you are giving away your fingerprints, but the headache of remembering 15 passwords, and one day you're going to say, you know what, the hell with it. I am going to give my fingerprint because I don't care. The easiness of, so if you take Uber, basically your movements, and it's not like we're doing anything bad. We're just taking a taxi from school to work to the shops, but you're giving, and there's a full history of however long you've been using Uber of every single move connected to other things on your phone. But it's exhausting to not being able to find a cash machine to pay the taxi or not know who's the taxi driver. So we give up and give away so many of our freedoms, sometimes out of convenience. But that's part of the problem. The bigger side of the problem is that we have to give them up because we don't have any other choice. And that's where kind of social difference and injustice come in. So say if you're in the UK, if you're a job seeker and you're receiving a job seeker allowance, you have to prove that you're searching for a job, and the proof is digital.
Yeah.
So you can't say, oh, I went around the shops and knocked on doors. You have to show a digital trail of, or else, right? And there are so many other cases. If you come as a migrant on any form of migrant visa of any kind, first of all, you have to have a biometric card. So you have to surrender your biometrics. You don't have any other choice. Yes. And you have to surrender a lot of other things. And you simply, so it kind of more about times when there isn't a choice. So you would have loved to have not been able to, or had the opportunity to not give away your data and your body data, your biometrics and your movements, but you can't because you have to. I mean, and this is kind of the spectrum, all the way the spectrum from the entirely free to the, say, people on house arrest or people who are released from prison who have got an anklet. So we kind of, all of us have a form of anklet. It's just the kind of the space of freedom is bigger. But the reason I'm thinking about this in relation to more totalitarian states, when I grew up in Russia, so I have a kind of really good sense, I think, of how different, even when they look the same, how different totalitarian or kind of really strong regimes feel. But it also sometimes makes people a lot more digitally literate. So, for example, Russia that bans various platforms regularly, everybody knows how to use a VPN and go around. If I ask my friends and peers, and myself included in the UK, and I'm talking about a very privileged group, citizens, educated, academics, do we know how to do VPN? Of course not, because we don't need to, right? So when you need to, and when kind of on a broader scale of the whole state, where you're under a lot more surveillance, you actually develop much better skills,
Yes.
which are kind of familiar to me as someone who grew up in the Soviet Union. You grow up with skills of protection and detection. So, today we talk about fake news, and people are surprised, oh my God, how come fake news and algorithms and Facebook lied to us? When you grow up in a country where you can't believe the newspapers ever, we never believed in what's in the newspaper. Nor did we ever believe in the state that's going to come and protect us, or the police person who's going to come and protect us, because they didn't. They would come and arrest you and send you to the gulag. So it's a completely different mindset and disposition of what you actually do with what is at your disposal. That said, of course, there are differences between. So I'm not conflating all countries in one. There are countries where the surveillance is much stronger. The control over citizen movement is much stronger. And yes, all of it at the moment is based on digital technologies of various kinds.
Kind of like is the people that has been in the minorities, or even not a minority, because, for example, women are not a minority, but then we get some skills by doing this, by having to circumvent some
exactly.
things.
Yes, maybe it goes in line with this statement of where there is oppression, there is resistance. So when there is digital oppression, then you form your digital forms of resistance. It's like using VPNs or taking different measures, hiding your identity. Yes. So maybe it's a new also, like different forms of political participations are created.
Absolutely. So that's an important point, actually. So political participation isn't just voting or demonstrating. There are endless ways in which we politically participate. And some of them, my endless frustration with Western scholarship on political participation, that it only sees particular things as meaning of political participation or political activism.
Yes.
Definitely.
Interesting. Yes. And I would like to move actually discussion to queer activism, and especially when it comes to thinking of the role of digital technologies in mobilizing queer activism. And for you, like, what are the potential challenges, especially in forming transnational queer solidarities at digital spaces?
It's interesting. Just before we came to this question, as we completed the previous one with various models of citizen participation, I was just about to bring an example, pre-digital, so maybe I'll start with that, of reading and misreading queer and LGBT activism in the late 80s, early 90s, when the Soviet Union first the doors were open to Western researchers and Western activists, and then the Soviet Union has collapsed. And before it became the kind of NGO playground, foreign NGO playground, there was some interesting research into Russia's LGBT queer stuff, including mostly by American journalists and academics, including questions, is there LGBT activism in Russia? Is this LGBT activism? And there is one book, an ethnography of an American scholar. I think she has some roots, kind of some of her family heritage from Russia, but she's an American scholar who spent some time as an ethnographer living in Russia and kind of researching those circles in the very, very early days of coming from the underground. Of course, they existed quietly and maybe on a much smaller scale in very different ways that would be recognizable in the West. So people would gather in houses, like around the kitchen table or in small house parties. So there isn't an LGBT club anywhere, but people gather there. Men would go and meet in parks. There was kind of an informal network of knowing where these parks are. So it was there, it just wasn't visible. So in her book, she was musing about basically why there isn't, and that was her starting question, why isn't there an LGBT activism with basically very strong mindset that the LGBT activism is this. It's a present of public LGBT spaces, is people publicly coming out, and all of that. So in the meantime, it's been over 30 years now, in the meantime, these things have emerged, and we can think about whether, I'm coming to your question of transnational solidarity, but we can think of whether these new forms, when we think about globalization and global spreads of trends, is it that now we have the space to have this LGBT presence, or queer presence that looks so recognizable to non-Russian eyes or Western eyes? Or was it something that was brought by visitors, by the media, by other activists, by NGOs, increasingly, and not just Russia, the rest of the Eastern Europe, former countries of the former Soviet Union, are now these days very much dependent on NGO funding. And NGO funding, mostly the one that they use, mostly sits in Europe and often dictates the ways of being an LGBT or the ways of queer politics. And I'm not saying it's all inauthentic. I mean, that's why I said it kind of goes back to the broader question of globalization. We're never just passive in accepting, other forms of influence. We're always in dialogue. But there is this violent form of blindness to what you don't see because you don't expect it, because you come with a particular framework in mind. And this violence then follows by financial violence, but so-called NGO industrial complex, where you dictate it to be in a particular way, and that's the only way to receive funding. But again, I think people resist because it's kind of both a field to adopt new ways of being, and I'm not saying if they're different or quote-unquote foreign, we shouldn't, right? You learn new ways of being and you embrace them, and it's incredible. So you've got, for example, trans rights are a lot more visible. So it both become a language that enables, but it also becomes a language that limits because it erases other forms of living, existing, experiencing, being together, which maybe would come under the umbrella of queer or under the umbrella of trans, but isn't necessarily recognizable in what we see as kind of global, often US-led trans rights. So it's really tricky. And the reason I'm talking about this so much is not only because it links to the kind of previous comment in terms of how we think about citizen participation, because to me it links to how do we think about queer citizen participation. Because what do we actually have in mind? What is the model, and also the question of transnational solidarity. So what are the models that we expect to happen when we ask how they can happen? It's a long answer to say, I don't know how transnational solidarities work. Sometimes they work, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's a question of language. Sometimes it's a question of, we don't want transnational solidarity. I don't, as someone who is queer but is no longer in Russia, Eastern Europe. Someone who is queer but not an activist at the moment. It's not something I want to speak about, on behalf of others, but I see it as I move through those circles of that violent lack of recognition of ways of being and ways of living that don't conform to the model of queer activism. That said, there's an incredible, wonderful, thriving, and very diverse scene of LGBT and queer activists, and also they're defined very differently in different countries. So in some, they use interchangeably, so we just use queer for LGBT. In some, they are in opposition to each other, so they could be, for example, there's beautiful work by Olga Plakotnik on Ukrainian queer politics, talking about how LGBT is a term to describe homo-nationalist politics, right? So LGBT as adopting, and that again goes to the question of what forms of activism or what forms of LGBT-ness do we expect. Those that conform with the state adopt the state national rhetoric, adopt certain forms of homonormativity and homopatriotism and homonationalism, versus queer that is defined as an alternative to it, as it's not just about sexuality or a range of non-normative genderqueer forms, gendered and sexual forms of being, but also an alternative radical form of politics. But it doesn't work that way in other contexts, because in other contexts queer has been used mostly in Euro-America, been used and overused, where queer means white and queer means Western. And it says that it's supposed to encompass all the other categories which are not LGBT, but it doesn't. So to me then, before we think about what kind of transnational solidarities, we actually need to think really carefully about what do we mean by the solidarity and who's going to be in solidarity with whom, right? So is it going to be homo-nationalists or queer homo-patriots, across countries that are going to unite in the fact that military is the ultimate queer way of belonging, because soldiers are so sexy, but also because we can be sexy and we can also fight and we can kill all the enemies. And that could be a form of transnational solidarity, which we actually should call global right-wing, alt-right.
Yeah.
Right? So, and I think also because the digital domain, the internet, social media is so widespread and so amorphic, and so there is a lot of mimicking going on. So we see a lot of rise of forms of violence, white supremacy, nationalism, which mimics tactics and forms of presentation of anti-state, anti-racist, anti-settler colonial activists. So there is very easy to mix, and it's also strategic because you deliberately adopt the tactics of those who you want to fight. It's not just about kind of stealing the hashtag, it's actually adopting the whole presentation. So then in this field, right, so how do we then, and it's an open question for me, can we create another form of queer solidarity? They won't necessarily be homo nationalist. They won't necessarily be about queerness that's white supremacy. How would it look like? Because once you get transnational solidarities, things can start falling apart really quickly. So people from the West, or so-called first world, or so-called second world, Eastern Europe, which is not the first world, but it's a white second world, traveling, say, to the Middle East as a form of transnational solidarity to teach people how to be queer, right? So it's really, really tricky, and I think the more we leave it as an open question, with kind of always checking with ourselves, probably the better place we're going to be in.
Yes. And so, also, sorry.
Okay, so maybe like to connect is, do you think, like, because when we think of homonormativity, which is so much embedded in global gay culture, where white gay men are so in the forefront, and which is very actually consumer-based culture in many ways, so where LGBT people are targeted as consumer groups, and in the meantime also we have a more homo-nationalist culture which is building queer hierarchies between different groups of queer people. And do you think these will be working together in forming this hegemonic understanding of let's say LGBTQ in digital spaces?
I think it already is. I think it's a given. I think this has already happened, has been happening, has already happened. But also, when we talk about the digital space, it's actually many different spaces.
Yes.
So maybe what we need to think about, going back to what we discussed in the seminar earlier and in the earlier questions about Gamergate or about online violence, maybe we should look at, rather than seeing the digital as this one space, we need to look at the form of not just hierarchies, but also the forms of violence. A range of violences that are happening digitally. So it could be online abuse, stalking, it could be many other things. It could be hacking and destruction. It could be because so much of this presence is now online, it's a kind of new battlefield. So we need to look at what kind of shapes these hierarchies take.
Yes. And maybe we can see then that the digital spaces as this antagonistic spaces also between these different readings of the digital space and different, how do you say, groups where people are also, forming more inclusively queer solidarities between different contexts, but also we still have these kind of hegemonic interventions on these spaces from capitalist and racialized, let's say, spaces.
I think we need to really hold the capitalist and corporate in mind. When we were talking about global gay culture, I was thinking, on one hand, dating apps and dating sites, which, as we know, are absolutely full of racial stereotypes. And people who openly put their racism out there on display, or say that, people that they're not interested in. So we have that. And then we've got community spaces, which, by the way, are not necessarily safe havens. They're often full of fights and flame wars and removing parts of the community and silencing marginalized voices. So, I've always thought about the digital as a battlefield rather than as anything else. Anything else is kind of a welcome, unexpected gift by definition, this is a place of fighting. And then, on kind of recent cyberstalking, cyberbullying, and kind of social media mobbing is only the latest incarnation of all the forms. And then we need to think about how they're magnified. To say if it's a Twitter mobbing of someone, it's on a massive scale.
Yeah.
And we also need to think about how this is basically a kind of spectacle that's unfolding in the eyes of everyone. Because when people fight, you target someone and you think in your closed battlefield arena, but actually anyone can read it.
Yeah.
And what are the implications of that? And if we pair that with surveillance, data aggregation, can get us to all kind of interesting places.
Yeah, definitely. I wanted to go back a little bit. When you were talking about queer, like the word kind of like sounded to me when sometimes you say women. Like, is every woman the same? There's no intersections in it. There's like, oh yeah, all women have the same things, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like no, we're
no.
like a super vast, really big group with different interests, different races, different everything. And it kind of like sounded that sometimes like I think queer, or like the word queer, can also be embodied this one type of queer, right? Might be white, Western, right? Maybe male,
young, able-bodied,
maybe able-bodied. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it kind of like misses all these other intersections that it might also can. I'm not sure if this is going to be investigated in recent or in this years, but I think it can also be something to check on, right? Like when we talk about queer culture or queer something, who are we referring to? Like, are we referring to only Western queer, only black, like only, who are we referring? And I think it would be nice if we just kind of like take this word as like with I don't know how to say it, like with very careful way, like in a very careful way, being like, so I'm going to use this word and I'm going to explain like what type of group I am referring to.
Absolutely.
Other than just just a thought, but it's just So I think we're run out of time.
Yes, we are running out of time, but it was such an interesting conversation we had. And thank you so much for joining us today, Adi, in your tight schedule, and for also sharing your knowledge and opinions with us. So yes, thank you.
And thank you both so much. The questions were absolutely amazing.
Thank you so much for coming, joining us, and everything.
Thanks. Thank you for listening to this episode. We hope you liked it. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. You can follow us on Facebook to learn about our activities, other updates, and give us feedback.
TechnAct was brought to you by the University of Gothenburg and the research cluster TechnAct. See you next time.